Do you believe that being the son of England's most famous and feared king could be an absolute privilege? Think again. Edward VI, the spoiled son of Henry VIII, lived a life surrounded by luxury, power, and almost impossible expectation, but also by betrayals, illnesses, and decisions that would shock any modern mind. From birth, Edward was the center of attention at court, the perfect heir meant to continue the Tudor dynasty. But behind the palace's golden doors, his world was full of intrigue, political manipulation, and family rivalry that would bewilder any adult, let alone a child. He grew up motherless, surrounded by tutors, advisors, and regents who did not always have his best interests at heart, and his fragile health only increased his vulnerability. Throughout his short reign, Edward VI made decisions that still provoke debate today. He disinherited his own sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, in a bold attempt to protect England from the return of Catholicism, naming Lady Jane Grey as heir, a choice that triggered chaos, intrigue, and eventually death. But it wasn't just politics that marked his story. His fervent Protestant faith led him to implement radical reforms that forever changed the Church of England, while harshly punishing any Catholic resistance, revealing the power and cruelty a teenager could wield when guided by ideals and court manipulation. And, of course, his early death at 15 added an air of mystery and tragedy to his life. What really caused his illness, medical neglect, or the psychological weight of a life that demanded maturity beyond his years? In this video, we'll explore little-known detail, shocking revelations about his family relationships, the intrigues surrounding his throne, and the moments that show that, even spoiled, Edward VI lived a darker and more disturbing fate than you might imagine. If you enjoy history, controversy, and the secrets behind the great names of royalty, subscribe now and leave your... Subscribing is important because it helps keep the channel active, ensures that new videos like this reach you, and allows us to continue bringing detailed and impactful content about history's secret. What personally surprised me the most was discovering how Edward, despite his young age, played such a decisive and controversial role in English politics and religion, being manipulated while simultaneously exerting real influence over the country's destiny. Stay with me until the end of the video, because the final revelation about Edward VI's death will leave you as shocked as I was when I uncovered the darkest and most unsettling details of Henry VIII's sons. Get ready to discover not just a young, spoiled king, but a story of power, tragedy, and secrets that still shock historians centuries later. Edward VI was born on October 12, 1537, at Hampton Court Palace, as the long-awaited legitimate son of King Henry VIII and his third wife, Jane Seymour. From the moment of his birth, his life was surrounded by an aura of expectation and almost obsessive care, as he represented the highly desired continuation of the Tudor lineage. The king's joy at Edward's birth was evident. After years of failed marriages and children who did not survive, he finally had a male heir to ensure the stability of the English crown. However, this happiness came at a tragic cost. Jane Seymour died a few days after childbirth, leaving Edward motherless before he could even have any memory of her. This fact profoundly shaped the young prince's childhood, as the maternal absence was filled by tutors, governesses, and relatives who sought to provide care but could never replace the natural emotional bond between mother and child. Edward's daily life was full of rigid routines, exhausting lessons, and constant supervision. Yet, even surrounded by luxury and attention, there was an implicit loneliness in his position. He grew up surrounded by servants and nobles of the court, but without the warmth and emotional comfort of a mother, which, according to historical accounts, influenced his temperament and sensitivity. Henry VIII, although initially showing enthusiasm and affection for his son, quickly became absorbed in his own affairs and political concerns, leaving Edward at the mercy of advisors and tutors who often saw the boy more as a political tool than a developing child. Among his early tutors were some of the most influential men in England, such as Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, who introduced Edward to Protestantism and the kingdom's religious politic, shaping his worldview from an early age. Edward's education was extremely demanding. He studied Latin, Greek, history, philosophy, and religion with an intensity few children of the time experienced. However, despite the wealth of knowledge and opportunities he received, the constant pressure and lack of freedom to play or simply be a normal child deeply marked his life experience. Interestingly, accounts describe Edward as a beautiful, intelligent, and sensitive child, but also fragile, often sickly, something that court physicians and historians suggest was linked both to genetics and the psychological stress of a childhood so loaded with expectation. Amid all this, Edward developed a strong dependence on the adult figures around him, often trusting tutors and advisors blindly, without ever questioning their intentions, which would later leave him vulnerable to political manipulation. The absence of his mother also had psychological. He grew up without a close model of feminine affection, which may have influenced how he later related to female figures at court and within his own family. Despite everything, Edward showed moments of tenderness and genuine curiosity, writing affectionate letters to his sister Mary and showing interest in the arts and music, revealing that even in an extremely rigid and formal environment, his humanity and sensitivity were not completely stifled. His privileged childhood, therefore, is paradoxical, full of wealth, educational opportunities, and advanced medical care for the time, yet marked by profound loneliness and emotional absence caused only by the early death of. This contrast between luxury and emotional deprivation helped shape the young prince, creating a personality that combined intelligence, sensitivity, curiosity, and, at the same time, an emotional vulnerability that would accompany Edward until his final days. Thus, even surrounded by all material comforts and courtly attention, Edward VI's true childhood was shaped both by privilege and by the lack of a maternal bond that, if it had existed, could have significantly transformed his way of seeing the world, his decisions, and his interactions with those around him, leaving indelible marks on the life of one of the youngest and most complex monarchs in English history. Edward VI's life within the Tudor family was marked by intense, complex, and often turbulent relationships, reflecting not only the historical circumstances in which he was born, but also the religious, political, and personal tensions that permeated the English court. From a very young age, Edward realized that his position as heir to the throne was not just a privilege, but also a burden that would shape every interaction with his family. His relationship with his older sister, Mary, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, began relatively affectionately. In his early years, Edward showed genuine interest, even writing affectionate letters that revealed a sense of closeness and curiosity, traits unusual for the rigid and formal Tudor court. However, as he grew, differences in religious convictions began to create significant distance. Edward, strongly influenced by his Protestant tutors, embraced a deeply reformist worldview, while Mary remained loyal to the Catholic traditions inherited from her mother. This religious divergence was not merely a matter of faith. It became a point of tension that influenced all future interactions between the siblings. Even as a young boy, Edward could display coldness and authoritarianism in decisions affecting Mary, including restricting her freedom and constantly monitoring her activities, measures reflecting the court's concern with loyalty and potential betrayal. His relationship with Elizabeth, his other sister and daughter of Anne Boleyn, was also nuanced and conflicted. From early on, Elizabeth was seen as an ambiguous figure in the line of succession, and Edward was instructed to observe her actions carefully. Initially, there was mutual respect and recognition, but as Edward solidified his position as king, fear of subversion and the influence of ambitious advisors created an atmosphere of distrust. Comments about Elizabeth and political decisions involving her show that Edward, despite his youth, understood the symbolic weight of every familial move and was often advised to act cautiously, even if it meant sacrificing personal feelings for the security of the. Beyond his sisters, Edward's relationships with other members of the Tudor family and the court were equally common. Tutors, uncles, and close nobles constantly influenced his perceptions of relatives, creating a network of loyalties and suspicions that Edward had to navigate carefully. The absence of his mother from his earliest days exacerbated his need for approval and affection. Yet this affection was often manipulated by adults with their own interest, creating a cycle of trust and distrust that persisted in his relationship. On a more personal level, historical accounts indicate that Edward, though reserved and sensitive, experienced moments of frustration and even anger at the limitations imposed by family norms and court protocol. He resented strict orders, the demands of tutors, and the constant intrigues that turned family relationships into political instruments. The tension between affection and political duty manifested in restrained displays of warmth and calculated decisions, balancing the desire for closeness with fear of betrayal. During adolescence, these tensions peaked, especially as Edward faced the growing responsibility of ruling and making decisions that could directly harm his closest family members. The situation was further complicated by the deaths of protective figures at court and the arrival of new advisors seeking to consolidate their own power, often encouraging Edward to act against family members to ensure political stability. Despite all the complexity, it is important to note that Edward never completely lost his humanity. Documents and letters he wrote reveal moments of tenderness, genuine concern, and curiosity about the well-being of his sibling, showing that even amid intrigue and distrust, he maintained emotional bonds that went beyond political strategy. This duality between the need to protect the realm and the desire to nurture authentic family relationship made his family life a continual experience of internal conflict. The portrait that emerges is of a young prince and king who grew up learning that family, while a source of affection, could also be an arena of rivalry and betrayal, where every gesture, word, and decision was scrutinized by both advisors and family members. Edward VI, therefore, developed a unique ability to navigate complex relationships, balancing emotion and duty, leaving a legacy that reveals both the fragility and the strength of a young monarch who, despite all familial adversities, sought to maintain his own integrity, values, and worldview, even when it meant confronting painful conflicts within his own home. From a very young age, Edward VI demonstrated a keen awareness of the weight of power and the importance of political and religious decisions that would shape England's destiny. Even though, in the eyes of many, he was still just a teenager, his education was carefully planned to prepare him not only as the heir to the throne, but as a ruler capable of understanding the complexity of state matters, and above all, the delicate balance between faith and politics. Influenced by his Protestant tutors, especially central figures like Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, Edward developed very strong religious convictions from childhood. He embraced Protestantism intensely and personally, not merely as a state policy, but as a belief that guided his actions and his understanding of the world. Contemporary accounts describe Edward as a young man extremely diligent in reading the scriptures, interested in theology and in the doctrinal nuances that separated Catholics and Protestants. He studied sacred texts with meticulous attention and participated in theological debates, even before reaching the age most people would consider appropriate for complex discussions about faith. His religious education was not only academic. Edward received practical instruction on how to implement his convictions in the political life of the kingdom. He quickly understood that religion and politics were inseparable, especially in a country that, during his parents' reigns, had witnessed drastic and violent shifts in religious balance. His ambition, though modest compared to experienced adults, was clear. He sought to consolidate Protestantism in England, remove any Catholic influence that might threaten the stability of his government. Edward VI, even as a young man, understood that faith could be used as a tool of power, but also as a sincere reflection of his personal convictions, which set his reign apart from previous ones. During his short time on the throne, Edward promoted a series of radical religious reform. He encouraged the translation and distribution of the Bible in English, allowing the population direct access to the scripture without the exclusive mediation of the clergy, something revolutionary for the time. Furthermore, he reformed worship, introducing standardized prayers and liturgies that reflected Protestant theology. Religious education of the people became a priority in his government, showing that Edward understood the power of faith as a mechanism of social cohesion, but also as a tool to consolidate his authority. In parallel, Edward demonstrated sophisticated political understanding, often influenced but not always fully controlled by his regents. During his childhood and adolescence, royal power was formally his, but in practice lay in the hands of advisors, such as his uncle Edward Seymour, and later, John Dudley. Still, Edward VI was not a passive figure. He actively participated in decisions on domestic and foreign policy, seeking to align his religious convictions with political strategies such as marriage alliances, treaties, and legislation that favored Protestantism and weakened any Catholic option. A clear example of his political determination was the careful preparation of the succession. When ill and aware of the proximity of his death, Edward challenged tradition and arranged for Lady Jane Grey to be named heir, aiming to ensure that England remained under Protestant rule and did not return to Catholicism under his sister Mary. This decision, though controversial and with tragic consequences, demonstrates how Edward VI understood the intertwining of religion and politics, perceiving that his spiritual legacy depended directly on the political choices he made. Moreover, Edward did not hesitate to confront members of the nobility or clergy who disagreed with his reforms, always defending his convictions with a firmness that impressed even the most experienced court advisor. His religiosity, combined with his ability to understand the political game, made him a young king who, despite his age, exercised real and tangible influence over the country's court. Interestingly, Edward VI also possessed a reflective and human side amid these ambitions. He recorded his own doubts and concerns in letters and notes, showing that even immersed in an environment of intrigue, life or death decisions, and theological debates, he continued to question the morality of his choices and how to ensure that his vision for England was just and lasting. This combination of religious firmness, political insight, and personal sensitivity makes Edward VI a unique figure in English history. A teenager who, facing fragile health and the complexities of a turbulent court, managed to leave a legacy that would be studied for centuries. His religious and political ambitions not only shaped his own life, but also defined England's immediate future, profoundly influencing succession, the faith of the population, and the power structure of the country. Even after his early death, the determination with which Edward VI pursued his religious and political convictions is remembered as a demonstration of courage, intelligence, and vision, rare qualities in any ruler, especially someone who was only 15 when he left the world, yet whose influence would endure for decades, showing that even as a youth, he understood that faith and politics were powerful instruments capable of forever changing the trajectory of an entire nation. Edward VI's court was, at the same time, a place of privilege, luxury, and learning, and an arena of intense intrigue and subtle manipulations that shaped every aspect of his life and reign. From the beginning of his ascent to the throne, still a child, Edward intuitively realized that the court was more than just a space for protocol and ceremony. It was a political minefield where every word, gesture, or decision could determine who gained influence and who fell from favor. At just 9 years old, Edward officially became king, but his power was limited by the need for regents, as England required an adult and experienced person to manage the affairs of the kingdom on his behalf. Initially, this role was assumed by his uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, who became Lord Protector. Seymour, though committed to Edward's safety and education, quickly revealed himself as ambitious and strategic, using the young king as a tool to consolidate his own power. The relationship between the regent and the young king was complex. Seymour had to appear devoted to Edward's well-being, while maneuvering policies, positions, and finances to strengthen his own position within the court. Edward, even at a young age, was not blind to relations. He observed and learned, often absorbing more than his advisors realized, demonstrating an early ability to understand the political game unfolding around him. However, his limited age and practical inexperience still made him vulnerable to external influences, and his trust in tutors and regents was not always entirely secure. After a period of growing power, Edward Seymour was eventually deposed and executed, a victim of his own ambition and the court's cruel politics. The episode served as a powerful lesson for Edward, who began to understand the fragility of alliances and the importance of carefully assessing the loyalty of those around him. After Seymour, John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, and later Duke of Northumberland, took control of the kingdom's administration. Dudley was even more astute and skilled at manipulating both politics and the young king. He quickly recognized that Edward VI possessed a keen mind and a natural inclination toward Protestantism, and he used these traits to advance his own political agenda, including arranging Edward's marriage to foreign candidates to strengthen alliances and influence the balance of power in Europe. Dudley carefully manipulated Edward's perception of other court members, creating a network of dependency and gratitude that kept the young king aligned with his objective. Dudley's influence also extended to the succession, as he was one of the architects behind naming Lady Jane Grey as a calculated move to protect the Protestant and political interests of his faction, but one that also revealed Edward's vulnerability to the manipulations of those he trusted. At the same time, the court was rife with internal rivalries, conspiracies, and temporary alliances. Nobles and advisors fiercely competed for positions, favors, and direct influence over the king, often using intrigue, gossip, and intimidation strategy to consolidate their power. Edward, though very young, was able to perceive these games and sometimes demonstrated discernment in dealing with them, balancing the need to obey experienced advisors with the desire to exercise his own judgment. A notable aspect of this dynamic was the constant tension between the king's duty to maintain political stability and the pressure to support decisions that might favor individual factions. Edward VI was forced to learn quickly that his word could determine destiny and that misplaced trust could result in betrayal and irreparable losses. In parallel, Edward showed genuine interest in the affairs of the kingdom, questioning, learning, and even suggesting measures that reflected his personal vision of justice, religiosity, and governance, although always within the limits imposed by his. This combination of intelligence, curiosity, and vulnerability created an environment in which Edward had to navigate carefully, evaluating who was an ally, who was manipulative, and which actions could protect both his position and England's future. The court, therefore, was an intense learning environment for Edward VI, where he developed essential political and strategic skills for any monarch, but always under the shadow of others' ambitions. Each regent, tutor, or advisor represented both an opportunity and a threat, and Edward had to balance his religious and moral conviction with the practical necessity of political survival. The competitive and sometimes treacherous environment of the court shaped his judgment and strengthened his understanding of power and its consequence, preparing him, albeit briefly, to exercise authority consciously. Edward VI's experience with court intrigue and manipulations reveals the complexity of ruling during a period when politics, religion, and family relations were closely intertwined, and how even a young king, surrounded by experienced and often unscrupulous adults, could develop strategic vision, discernment, and a deep understanding of the delicate balance of forces that kept England in order. The court, with all its dangers and opportunities, served as a school of cunning, shaping not only Edward's immediate political decisions, but also his character, early maturity, and ability to make choices that, even at 15, had a lasting impact on the country's history, demonstrating that despite his youth and adversity, Edward VI possessed rare intelligence and political insight that allowed him to navigate with relative skill the labyrinth of intrigue and manipulation that defined his. Edward VI, despite his privileged birth and meticulous education, was deeply marked by his fragile health, which from an early age indicated signs of physical and emotional vulnerability. Even growing up surrounded by attentive doctors and tutors, Edward frequently suffered illnesses that required constant care. And these early medical conditions shaped not only his body, but also his life experience, personality, and way of coping with the pressures of power. Historically, it is believed that Edward suffered from chronic respiratory illnesses and recurring fevers, possibly aggravated by genetic predispositions, insufficient nutrition, or even the strict conditions of the court, which often demanded more from him than his young body could bear. Despite his slender appearance and sharp intellect, the young king was physically fragile, and his delicate health accompanied every moment of his life, from childhood play to the complex administration of the kingdom. As Edward took on political responsibilities, his physical fragility became an increasing concern for his advisors, who feared both for the continuity of governance and the emotional impact that a serious illness could have on the young king. Contemporary records describe Edward as determined and diligent, even during periods when fever or physical discomfort limited his energy, showing a rare combination of willpower and vulnerability. Between 1551 and 1553, Edward's health began to deteriorate more noticeably. He experienced episodes of high fevers, persistent coughing, and increasing weakness, symptoms that some modern historians believe may have been related to tuberculosis or a severe form of typhoid fever, although precise diagnoses are impossible to confirm from historical record. Edward's physical decline coincided with a period of intense political and religious decisions, which increased stress and likely contributed to worsening his condition. Even debilitated, Edward remained actively involved in government matters, showing remarkable courage and dedication. But each effort took a high toll on his already fragile constitution. His illness was not only a physical problem, but also a source of emotional and political tension at court. Constant concern for his health influenced strategic decisions, alliances, and even the way he interacted with family members and advisors. From his sickbed, Edward still discussed succession policies, religious reforms, and governance strategy, reflecting how active his mind remained even when his body was. It is important to highlight that Edward's fragility also affected his familial and personal relations. His illness created an even greater dependence on tutors, advisors, and doctors, while simultaneously generating feelings of isolation and frustration, as he knew his ability to act was limited by factors beyond his control. Historically, his situation was exacerbated by the pressure to consolidate religious and political reforms that had become extremely controversial, making his decline not only a physical experience, but also a psychological and emotional one, in which the responsibility of an entire kingdom rested on the shoulders of a sick child. In the final months of his life, Edward faced continuous fevers, extreme fatigue, and episodes of severe weakness, which restricted his ability to move, concentrate, and even communicate normally. Yet, he maintained admirable involvement in politics and decisions that would shape England's future, including preparing the succession for Lady Jane Grey in an attempt to protect the Protestant advances achieved during his reign. His illness, therefore, was not merely a medical event, but a catalyst for crucial decisions, revealing both the young king's vulnerability and his exceptional maturity and vision. Edward VI died on July 6, 1553, at the age of 15, leaving behind an unstable kingdom and a court marked by tension and the ambitions of advisors who had manipulated his youth and fragility. His premature death triggered an immediate and profound succession crisis, showing how his physical weakness had been a determining factor not only in his personal life, but also in England's political history. Historically, Edward VI is remembered not only for his religious reforms and political decisions, but also for the courage he demonstrated in facing illness, showing remarkable discipline and determination for someone so young. His physical decline became a lens through which historians and scholars understand the complexity of his reign. A teenager who, despite a debilitated body, exercised significant influence, made decisions with lasting impact, and sought to balance personal convictions with the practical necessity of preserving the stability of a turbulent kingdom. Edward VI's fragility and the way he faced illness reveal a fascinating contrast between vulnerability and strength, innocence and responsibility, and remind us that even in absolute power, the human body imposes limits that even the brightest young mind cannot overcome. His life and early death left a lasting legacy, reminding everyone that leadership and courage do not depend on age, but on the determination to act rightly, even in the face of inevitable limitations. The legacy of Edward VI is one of the most fascinating and complex aspects of his brief yet intense life and reign. Although he ruled for only 6 years and died at 15, the mark he left on England's history is profound and multifaceted, reflecting both his personal achievements and the turbulent circumstances that shaped his existence. Edward VI is often remembered for his religious reform, which transformed the country in lasting ways. He was the monarch who consolidated the Protestant Reformation initiated by his father, Henry VIII, taking it to a more systematic and radical level. Under his leadership, the Church of England distanced itself more clearly from Catholic traditions, introducing the Bible in English to allow the people direct access to the scriptures and reforming liturgical and doctrinal practices. This religious boldness, though supported by his advisors, also reflected his personal convictions, showing that Edward possessed an early understanding of faith as a tool for national identity and political. But Edward's legacy extends far beyond religious reform. He is also remembered for his courage and determination to govern, despite his extreme youth and fragile health. His ability to comprehend complex political issues, make significant decisions, and navigate court intrigues demonstrates an impressive maturity for someone aged 9 to 15. Edward showed that even under physical and emotional limitations, it was possible to exercise leadership with vision and discernment. The impact of his reign is also evident in matters of succession and the kingdom's stability. The decision to name Lady Jane Grey as his successor, though it led to tragic political consequence, reveals his conscious effort to protect the Protestant advances he had promoted, ensuring that England would not immediately revert to Catholicism under his sister Mary. This controversial and risky choice demonstrates that Edward VI possessed a strategic understanding of long-term politics, even while facing his own mortality. Additionally, his personal life and complex family relationships offer valuable lessons about the nature of power, responsibility, and human vulnerability. Edward VI was a young man who grew up without a mother, surrounded by tutors and advisors, constantly observing and assessing others' intentions. Yet he still managed to cultivate moments of tenderness, curiosity, and humanity. This combination of physical fragility and moral strength created a monarch who, though young, could inspire respect and admiration, leaving a lasting impression on those who knew him and on historians who studied him. Historically, Edward VI is viewed in varied ways. Some consider him a visionary monarch who promoted profound changes in a short period, while others see his reign as a potential tragedy, cut short by premature death and the crises that followed. This duality is part of his legacy, revealing that a ruler's greatness is measured not only by the length of his reign, but by the intensity, impact, and coherence of his actions. Furthermore, Edward VI's reign brought lasting reflections on leadership, responsibility, and the weight of decisions made under extraordinary circumstances. He shows us that age and physical fragility are not obstacles to exercising significant influence, and that the combination of personal conviction, strategic intelligence, and moral courage can shape the trajectory of a nation even within a short time frame. Edward's cultural and educational legacy is also remarkable. His education and emphasis on learning, reading, and religious understanding set standards for future monarchs, reinforcing the idea that knowledge and wisdom are essential tools for governance. Today, Edward VI is remembered as an example of youth combined with responsibility, as a monarch who, despite severe limitations, left an indelible mark on history. His religious reforms, political decisions, and the way he faced illness and emotional pressures continue to be studied as demonstrations of character, vision, and early leadership. His life reminds us that the impact of a person is measured not just by the time they spend in the world, but by the intensity with which they live, the courage with which they face challenges, and the ways their choices resonate far beyond their existence. Edward VI remains a symbol of the complexity of ruling in turbulent time, a young monarch whose intelligence, sensitivity, and moral strength continue to fascinate scholars and the curious alike, proving that even those who live short lives can leave profound and lasting legacy. He teaches us that leadership, vision, and conviction can coexist with vulnerability, and that decisions made in critical moments have the power to shape not only immediate history, but the cultural, religious, and political trajectory of an entire nation, making Edward VI an eternally relevant and inspiring figure whose story continues to be studied and admired by all those seeking to understand the complexity of monarchy, faith, and human nature. And so we reach the end of the story of Edward VI, the spoiled son of Henry VIII, whose life, despite its luxury and power, was marked by intrigue, controversial decisions, and a premature death that continues to shock historians to this. His journey shows us that even the most privileged can face tragic destiny, and that power, when combined with youth and manipulation, can have devastating consequences. If you enjoyed this video and want to continue exploring impactful stories from history, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Subscribing is very important because it helps the channel grow, ensures you don't miss any new content, and allows us to bring you even more fascinating and controversial stories like. For those who can support the channel even further financially, consider using the Super Thanks feed. Every contribution helps us produce more detailed and high-quality videos. And if you can't, that's no problem. Leave a comment telling us what surprised or shocked you the most about this story. We really want to hear your thoughts and discuss every detail. And before you go, don't click away just yet. In the video appearing on the screen now, you'll find an even more intriguing and captivating story than that of Edward VI. So click and continue your journey through history, because the next video will be hooked from start to finish. More mysteries, controversies, and royal secrets you never imagined.